Welcome to A Pair of Bookends, the book club you can carry anywhere. I'm your host, Hannah MacDonald, and I'll be bookending the conversation with some of the most exciting voices from the bookish world. On today's episode, I am joined by Ben Markovits to discuss his latest novel, The Rest of Our Lives, which is out now and published by Faber. Ben is a British-American writer based in London, where he teaches creative writing at Royal Holloway, University of London. Ben is the author of 11 novels, including Either Side of Winter, You Don't Have to Live Like This, and The Sidekick. His essays, stories, poetry and reviews have been published in The New York Times, The Guardian, The Paris Review and Granta, to name a few. In 2013, Granta selected him as one of their best of young British novelists, and in 2015 he won the Eccles British Library Writer in Residence Award and the James Tate Black Memorial Prize. Here to chat about his latest novel, welcome Ben to A Pair of Bookends.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Now, before we get into your book, which I absolutely loved, I would love to ask what you have been recently reading.
So I teach at Royal Holloway, so this is my teaching term. I teach 3 months a year, and I teach a class called The Great American Novella. And so a lot of my time is spent rereading the books on the list. So I just finished reading The Sun Also Rises by Hemingway. I'm going to be reading Their Eyes Were Watching God this week. I've also got Pnin by Nabokov to read. So anyway, a lot of my reading is what I'm about to teach.
Amazing. Their Eyes Were Watching God is a book that has been on my list for ages and I've still not got round to it. So you've just...
It's a very beautiful book, yeah.
Yeah, I've heard that it is. So you've just given me the nudge I needed to go away and read it. But let's get on to your book, The Rest of Our Lives, which, as I said, I absolutely loved this book. Could you give the listeners a summary of what The Rest of Our Lives is about?
Yeah, it's a story about a guy whose wife had an affair when their kids were small, and they survive it, but he makes a kind of quiet deal with himself that when the youngest leaves home, he can reevaluate the marriage. Mm-hmm. And that makes it sound too much like a contract, but the book begins when he drops his youngest at university, and instead of going back home, he keeps driving. The reason I say I hesitate a little bit because I don't want to sound like for 12 years he plotted this. He didn't, but he had it in the back of his mind that when the kids left home, they've got to find some other way to live the rest of their lives. And that's the kind of premise of the novel.
Yes, and it's wonderful. And there are so many elements to it that I absolutely loved. I love any book that explores complex family dynamics. It is like catnip to me. But
Are you part of a complex family dynamic?
Essentially, yes.
How many siblings does that mean?
I have, this is where it gets complicated, 2 siblings. We have the same mum and dad. And then I have another sibling where we share the same dad, but we have different mums. And then I have a stepbrother and a step sibling that I don't have contact with. So there's lots of scattering about.
5 or 6 or something like that.
Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's complicated. But yeah, that explains a lot why I love reading books like that. I want to ask, first of all, about Tom, who is the narrator of the story. And it feels like he's sort of breaking a fourth wall. And I wanted to know if you intended for it to feel like he was in this kind of conversation with the reader.
That's interesting. I mean, I try to write conversational prose. So I try to write the kind of sentences that you could actually just say to somebody and not the kind of sentences that you could only come up with if you were staring at the screen for hours trying to find the perfect word. And so maybe some of what you're talking about has to do with that.
Yes.
I'd like to be able to read it out in my normal voice. I'm not Tom. I don't have his marriage. We did share a set of medical symptoms, which is part of what the book is about. But anyway, so if it seems conversational, it's because that's the kind of language I like to write.
Yeah, I mean, I'm an actor and I really enjoyed the way that it flowed because it reads like a kind of monologue, really. And I think, yeah, I just really enjoyed that. And I think it's a great way to write, and not many books feel like it's sort of in conversation with the reader. So
I mean, I guess I figure that the language that people actually use in their lives, they use it because it's the best way of getting across what they want to get across.
Exactly.
It's the most efficient language, and it's in some ways the kind of most resonant language because it sounds like it comes from a human being. Anyway, so as much as possible, that's the kind of language I try to stick with.
But I mean, as I said, I loved it. Now, the book is a really intimate exploration of a long-term marriage and the sort of layers and complexities that brings up with a life, lived and created with another person. And I wanted to ask what interested you in exploring, a long marriage rather than, say, a relationship at the start or something that's kind of fresh and new.
That's interesting. Yeah. I mean, I'm trying to think of the best way to answer that. I think long-term relationships are really interesting because they have such accumulation of history that everything matters.
Yes.
And there's some dramatic things that happen in this book, but for the most part, I like to write about the sort of ordinary events that shape people's days and lives. And one of the things that makes those events so meaningful is family
Yeah.
and the history and the fact that every little thing that you do relates to other things that you have done and long time arguments that you've had with siblings, lovers, kids, parents, and wives and husbands, so that everything becomes meaningful and part of a bigger conversation. It doesn't have to be an argument, but part of a bigger conversation. And that seems possible in a long marriage. You were writing about a short-term relationship. The dynamic is totally different.
Yeah, completely. I think it's so interesting to look at the kind of the grudges that can be held or the like silent kind of communication that goes on, the things that, you know about that person that somebody new to their life wouldn't, there's a history there and that brings a kind of a lot of complications with it. I'm not speaking as somebody that has been in a long-term marriage because I'm only 30, but from this book, that's what I kind of learned about that. What I was really interested in was reading about the experience of a father because I read so many books where, it's the kind of mother's perspective. And I think it's quite, I don't know if it's rare in fiction or whether it's just that I've not come across it as much, but it was really interesting to read about his perspective. And he's really reflexive throughout the book of his sort of decisions that he's made and where he feels like he might have failed as a father. And at one point, he describes his daughter as being stuck with her inadequate parents. Why do you think that Tom feels inadequate?
Well, part of it has to do with the affair.
Yeah.
And so he has two kids. He has a younger daughter and an older son, and he's got different relations with each of them. The son was 12 when his wife had an affair, and he was old enough to know what was going on and to have some insight into this stormy period of his parents' marriage. The daughter was only 6, and so she didn't really know. She wasn't old enough to feel what her dad was going through. And in some ways, that makes his relationship with her much simpler because he doesn't have to explain, he doesn't have to think about it, he doesn't have to have conversations with her about his marriage because she didn't see the worst of it. And they have a really good kind of easy relationship. He's also just scared. He's scared that you spend as a parent, in this case, I think 24 years of your life looking after kids, and your relationship with your wife is a part of that. And then the kids leave home, and suddenly you've got to find a new sort of relationship with your wife, which is part of what he's running away from. So the book is it's bookended by his relationship with his kids. So it starts there's a lot about the daughter that he's dropping off at university at the beginning, and then he drives to California where his son is in grad school, and he hangs out with his son. And so I kind of wanted, even though it's a novel about a guy running away from his family, it's a novel that's all about his family.
Yeah, and I think what was really interesting as well in the book is looking at the kind of the patterns that we repeat, and from our own upbringing and what might be passed down to our children. And I'm really interested in that. And at one point, you write, whether you want to or not, you end up reproducing the structure of your childhood, which I thought was a really interesting kind of concept. Could you talk a bit about that and what you kind of learned through writing Tom and his relationship with his children?
Yeah, I mean, so very specifically in his case, his dad ran off when he was a teenager, and part of what he resented his father. I mean, he loved his father, but he resented him for it. And part of what he's dealing with is that as he leaves his home behind and he drives across the country, that on some level he's doing again what his own dad had done. And it should be said that his wife, who had the affair, is trying to work through why she might have had an affair. And she realizes that her own father had died more or less around the same time, as more or less around when she was about 14. And so their son was about 12. And so part of what she thinks is that she's dealing with the aftermath of her own childhood that was marred by her dad's leaving. And that's partly why maybe she was seeking for something when her kid turned that age. Anyway, I mean, these are all sort of murky things to talk about, but the idea is that when you're a parent, you either run away from the childhood that your own parents gave you, or you run toward it, and probably you do both at the same time.
That's so interesting. Yeah, it makes me reflect a lot when I read about, the patterns that are being repeated and stuff. I'm currently working on a play about the mother-daughter relationship, and it's exploring body image and how a mother's relationship with her own body is kind of passed on to her daughter.
Yeah.
So I'm really fascinated in the patterns that kind of play out in those sort of dynamics. I want to ask you about the affair, because I think affairs are so interesting, and I'm really drawn to a novel novel that features an affair. Again, I don't know what that says about me, but
You
I
get it in the
was.
first line of the book. I mean, the first line of the book announces that there's going to be an affair in this.
Yes, yeah, but why was it specifically an affair that you wanted to look at as the thing that had kind of set off this chain of events in their marriage?
It's an interesting question. I don't know that I have a clear-cut answer for it. I know that I wrote the first page of the book probably a year or 6 months before I wrote the rest of it. I was just sitting down and it occurred to me. Maybe I was interested. You read a lot of stories about from the point of view of men who have had affairs, and it seemed interesting to me to write a story about a guy who thinks he didn't do anything wrong.
Yes.
And I don't want to make his marriage seem loveless. I mean, I hope it's a tender book. He spends a lot
Yes,
of
very much
time
so.
when he's away from his wife thinking about her
Yeah.
and trying to sympathize with what had happened to her and feeling that on some level it must have been his own inadequacy that led to the breakdown. But I did want to write about a guy who felt like I haven't done anything wrong and yet my life hasn't turned out the way I might have hoped it would. So my wife had an affair. He's been suspended at work for reasons he doesn't think make sense, and his health is failing. And his kids are leaving. And no matter how well he tried to behave as a father, a husband, and an employee, he feels that he's come to the end of the line.
Yeah.
And I was interested in that idea. I specifically interested in the idea that his believing that he didn't do anything wrong might have been part of the problem.
That's interesting. It is a very tender and intimate portrayal of their marriage. And I think, like you said, it's not a loveless marriage. And yes, she's made mistakes and so is he. And he is kind of running away. But I think, he's running away for a number of reasons. And I don't think it's solely,
Yeah.
to escape their house. I think he's kind of, it feels like everything's sort of out of control for him, and that's probably his coping mechanism, I guess. And I wanted to ask you about the health complications that he faces in the book, and you do explore COVID as well, which I was really interested in because I know a lot of writers like to avoid that topic and they don't feel kind of ready to write about it.
Yeah.
And I was wondering why you wanted to write about COVID and the sort of health complications he faces.
It's interesting. I mean, so some of it, so the symptoms that he had, I had when I was writing the book. I didn't know what they were, and he doesn't at the beginning of the novel either. And I gave them to this character, even though his life isn't in other ways like mine, partly because I thought it would be an interesting symbol of the way that he's reaching a moment of crisis. His, in addition to the marriage failing and the kids leaving home and the troubles at work, his health is failing.
Yeah.
And I thought there'd be something there I could work with as he sets off across America. And by the time I finished the book, I was going through chemo because I had figured out what was wrong with me. I had lymphoma, and this, ultimately is what he realizes that he has towards the end of the novel. And so I don't know what exactly with what intentions I gave them to him at the beginning. The COVID stuff comes in partly just because that's when I set the novel, and you can't avoid it. If you're going to set a book in this in any period in the 21st century, if it's pitched around those years, you've got to think about it.
Yeah.
But also because the thing that happened to me happened to him, which is that for a while I thought what I had was just long COVID,
Right.
and the doctor couldn't figure out what it was.
I hope you're doing okay. I mean,
Yeah, so far as I know, I'm in remission.
Good,
The
amazing.
doctors are great and they keep checking up on me, but
Good.
no, I feel much better than I did.
Well, I'm very glad. Yeah, that's really scary. And I know that long COVID is also very scary. So,
Yeah.
those symptoms are really awful. And I know people that have also dealt with it. So, yeah, it's just not a
Yes.
nice thing at all. But I thought the way that you explored it, it was handled really well because, yeah, I think, like you said, it's something that you can't really avoid because it was a huge catastrophic time that so many people were affected by. So yeah, it is unavoidable.
And it shaped his relationship with his kids. I mean,
Yes.
a lot of parents report, and I would say the same of us, that there was this kind of sense, relief is the wrong word, but you get your kids to yourself every night because no one was
Yes.
going out, and you watch movies with them. And it's a very big part of his relationship with his daughter that they would sit around watching Friends together.
They did watch Friends together.
One of the things that's really hard to do about writing the pandemic is that it shifted so fast. I mean, even though it lasted a while, the particular rules, who was wearing masks and who wasn't, what it was like to walk into a hospital, all of those things varied week to week, the travel rules.
Yeah.
It's hard to track this stuff down online because it was shifting again and again. You can't quite remember, was it in May that I couldn't fly? Was it, anyway, so all these details are very hard to get right because the internet doesn't really help you solve these sorts of problems.
Did you say that you were writing this around the time of COVID?
So I wrote it, I'm trying to think now. No, I guess we're still in the time of COVID.
Yes,
so I'm
yeah.
not quite sure when
Sorry,
it ended. But no, most of the restrictions had been lifted and we were living more or less normal lives, I think, when I was writing most of it. But I can't remember remember, you know.
I was just wondering if, because the novel feels so kind of dynamic, and obviously it is a road trip novel, and I just wondered if that was kind of inspired from, wanting
Yeah.
to to be able to go on a road trip and be able to kind of escape from, we were stuck in our houses for so long, and I just wondered if that was an eagerness to want to kind of explore the world.
Yeah, I think that must have gone into it. That's an
Yeah.
interesting point. And also just, one of the strange things about being a parent is that you try to present to your kids this idea that their world is totally stable and unchanging,
Hmm.
which means that your life is stable and unchanging. But it's hard to live that way. Most people want to look forward to some kinds of change.
Yeah.
And so the road trip is about partly driven by his sense that he wants stuff to continue to happen to him.
Yes. Yeah.
He wants change in his life. He doesn't want it just to be stasis, which I think a lot of middle-aged people feel.
I think a lot of people feel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But when you're younger, most of the changes are you can imagine being good.
Yeah.
As you get older, most of the changes just don't seem so good. It's
Oh God.
ill health, divorce.
Don't worry me.
Yeah. Sorry.
I've just turned 30. I'm scared now. No, I do want to ask about the road trip element of it, because I love traveling myself, and
Have you driven through America? Have you
I
driven across
haven't,
America?
and it
Yeah.
sounds incredible. It looks incredible, and
Yeah.
there's been so many kind of shows about it. Like people going on road trips across America, or it's been featured in films and things like that. So I've just kind of seen this very glittery sort of look at it, and I wanted to ask, have you ever done that?
Yeah, I've done several road trips across America when I was a kid, just after college with a couple of buddies and my sisters. And then actually, this road trip is partly based on one I took with my family, not without my family.
Oh,
We drove from Texas, where I grew up, to California. No, it's amazing. It's an amazing thing to do. And even though, in fact, on that road trip, I was getting sicker and sicker in the way that Tom is getting sicker. But somehow it just made everything more intense in a sort of wonderful way, this sense of the fragility of things.
absolutely. Do you have any like favorite places or moments from that trip?
Oh, yeah. I mean, Big Bend National Park, which I've never been to. I'm from Texas, but it's in, West Texas, and
Yeah.
just extraordinary. And it's not particularly overrun. The North Rim of the Grand Canyon, he doesn't cover it. Tom doesn't go to these places in the novel, but we did. And just the landscape is so extraordinary to drive through that even if you're spending 8 hours a day in the car, you kind of don't mind,
Yeah.
because you're driving through a movie. It's
Exactly, yeah. When I was reading it, I was like, this is so different to when
yeah.
I've driven from Manchester to London.
Yes.
It's like a completely different, I mean, I get moments where I'm driving through kind of countryside, and, the British countryside is very beautiful in
Yeah.
parts, but yeah, when you're kind of going from city to city here, it's just, there's not as much beautiful landscape as I imagine there is in America. I have read that you were once a professional basketball player, and
Yeah.
there are a lot of sports scenes throughout the book which feature a lot on his road trip. He ends up playing ball quite a lot, basketball, and through these sort of scenes, I think we see what it means to Tom in terms of what the sport, means to Tom in terms of nostalgia and his sort of shifting relationship with not only the sport, but with, his health and his body.
Yeah.
Why was it important to you to feature those scenes?
Well, partly I just, I want characters to have stuff in their lives that isn't just the plot of the book.
Yes.
And then, but the trouble from a writer's point of view is if you're going to write about those elements of people's lives, you have to know them really well. People have lots of hobbies and interests and concerns that writers find it difficult to get into because they just don't share them. And I do have this love of basketball. It's also, so one of his excuses for driving off like this is that when he was in grad school and wondering what to do with his life, he had this idea of writing a book about driving across America and playing pickup basketball. My guess is a lot of your listeners might not know what pickup basketball is, but it's this wonderful tradition in basketball that in any court in any city in America, you can just show up, and if there's a game going on, there's a kind of etiquette involved in how to join the game, and you meet all kinds of people. It's a way of seeing the country. And so as he drives off, he partly thinks to himself, he's a law professor, but what he really wants to do is be a writer. Maybe this is the thing that he should have done. And in a way that connects to sports, because one of the difficult parts of giving up on sports is that it's giving up on your sense of who you wanted to be when you were a kid. That's where the nostalgia comes in. And I think a lot of people have a similar sense about writing. They wanted to be a writer, but then real life intervenes and they make decisions that seem to them responsible, but also involve giving up on that sense of who they thought they would be when they were children. And so Tom is wrestling with those things.
I didn't know about the pickup basketball. I mean, obviously I read it in the book, but I just assumed it was, just like a term for basketball that I just didn't know. I didn't realize, that there's a particular etiquette. So that's really cool. And I do think it's really nice that, to explore a person's hobbies, because you're right, it's a big part of their life,
Yeah.
and it shows a lot about who they are as a person. And I don't think a lot of writers do explore it as much, which I think is why I was particularly struck with this book, that it felt like there were a lot of scenes where he was thinking about basketball or talking about
Yeah.
basketball. So yeah, I absolutely loved that. Do you think he ever finishes the book?
No, probably not. I mean, it's part of what makes him sad is the sense that he did want to write this book, but he's not sure at the age of, I think he's 55 in the novel,
Hmm.
that he still really wants to anymore, because you get tired even of the things that you're nostalgic about.
Yeah, that's very true. I do think it's a really cool concept for a book.
Yeah, no, I would love to do it. Maybe I should do it.
I think you should.
Yeah,
Take one for Tom.
yeah.
I would love to ask, actually, I absolutely love this book, and I think that's quite apparent, but I would love to know what the writers and books are that have influenced you and your work.
That's interesting. So, I mean, I've written 3 novels about Byron, and I did, I loved the Romantics when I was a kid. But, one of the things that really distinguishes him from the other poets of his generation is that at his best, he uses the kind of language that people could speak, which is striking in poetry. You don't really associate it with poetry in the same way. He has this poem in which he advises people that if they go to Venice during the carnival, they should bring ketchup with them because during Lent, the Venetians don't serve any sauce with their food. And so for English travel, anyway, it's not the kind of detail you expect in a poem, but
Yeah.
he's really doing it deliberately. He wants to say that poetry is also about bringing ketchup to the table.
What is that poem called? Sorry.
It's called Beppo. It's a really beautiful. It's a long poem. I mean, I don't know, like it's 15 pages long,
Oh,
but
wow.
it's great, and it's about the carnival season in Venice, and very specifically, it's about a woman whose husband disappears at sea, and she thinks he's dead, and then 20 years later he shows up, but by that point she's taken another lover, and that's the subject of the poem.
That sounds
Um,
great.
it's really good.
I haven't come
Um,
across it before.
one of my favorite road trip novels, which I've actually been dipping into, is Richard Ford's Independence Day. He wrote a series of books about a guy called Frank Bascom that they're the kind of novels that take you through every moment of a character's day for several days. And the wonder of it is that he manages to make it all interesting. What breakfast they get, what conversations they have with their kids on the phone, doing their jobs, talking to colleagues. And it's so richly detailed that by the end, you're living these days with him.
I haven't read that.
It's
Yeah,
great. Independence Day. It's
yeah.
slow, but it builds, it builds, it builds.
That sounds fantastic. I would also like to, I don't know if you've come across Girls by Kirsty Capes.
Nope.
That's a really great road trip novel. I think it came out last year, and that is a fantastic novel about a couple of sisters, and their mother is a famous artist, and she's
Uh-huh.
died. And her mother has kind of two things that she tells them that when she dies, she wants to happen. And one of
Mhm.
them is that she wants her art thrown away. She wants it thrown off the canyon or something. And then her other thing is that she wants her ashes poured in another part of America. And so they go on this road trip across America, and their aim is to do those two things for
Yes.
her. But then what kind of comes out of that is, this sort of all the grudges that have been held over
Yeah.
time, and yeah, all that kind of stuff. So yeah,
So where do they start out from?
I actually can't remember where they start out from. I think they actually live in England, and then they fly.
Uh-huh.
They go over to America. Sorry, not yeah. They go back over to America, and then they do
Yeah.
this road trip.
Interesting. Yeah.
But yeah, I've found that I've really gotten into road trip novels, and I'm
It's a
definitely
nice
going to
genre.
try.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And the other one was Independence Day that you just said.
Independence Day by Richard Ford. Yeah.
Great. I'm going to have to get to that one. My final question for you, Ben, is to ask for a recommendation. So that can be anything. It can be books, TV, film, sort of anything goes for this one.
Okay. So I'm going to recommend a TV show that my whole family watched during the pandemic. It's called Friday Night Lights. Have you heard of Friday Night Lights?
I have it. Is it American football?
It's American football, but it's small town Texas. It's actually filmed, the football scenes are filmed at the same stadium in Austin where my high school played its football games.
No way.
But it's really just about small town Texas life and high school kids trying to figure out who they are. It's a lot of fun, but it's also just beautifully done.
Yeah, I mean, I think I might have watched like small clips of it, but my best friend that I lived with at university, he played American football like
Oh, did he? Yeah.
at university. Yeah,
Yeah.
it was one of the societies at uni, and it was really popular. So
Yeah.
that was interesting in itself. But yeah, he was really obsessed with that show, and would
It's a
watch it all the
totally
time.
obsessive show. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Is Friends another favorite of yours, or is that just something that you plucked out for the book?
No, I mean, I really like the early series, and the later series are fine. I think the early series are really good. I have watched it with my kids. I watch a lot of Seinfeld with my son, especially. I don't know if you've watched any
I've
Seinfeld.
not, no.
It's I mean, it's a kind of precursor to Friends, a group of friends in New York. But unlike Friends, there's no emotion in it. They never learn anything. They never improve. Uh, they just keep going about their routines. It's very good. But one of the things, just quickly about Friday Night Lights, that's so nice about it is there are almost no villains in it. I mean, there are people who do good things and bad things,
Yeah.
but it's almost sympathetic to everybody. And that seems actually kind of lifelike.
Yeah, for sure. I'm gonna have to give this a go because, yeah, I need something that's quite addictive to watch, and that feels like a nice one to go to, especially as it was recommended to me so much when I was at uni, and I just was
There you
like, yeah,
go.
no,
The time has come.
the time has come. But thank you so much, Ben, for this wonderful book. For our listeners, The Rest of Our Lives is out now and published by Faber. I'm going to pop a link in the show notes for you to order yourselves a copy. But finally, Ben, thank you so much for
Thank you
joining
very
me on
much.
A Pair of Bookends. It's been lovely chatting. And for our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. And if you want to give us a follow, you can do so at A Pair of Bookends Pod on Instagram and at A Pair of Bookends on X and TikTok. And Ben, is there anywhere that the listeners can follow you, or are they best finding you through your books?
Through the, I mean, I've got some pieces coming out. I've got a piece about a bike ride that I took with my son 2
Amazing.
years after going into remission that will come out in the Financial Times. But I'm afraid I'm not on any social media.
Oh wow, no, I'm definitely going to look forward to that. Do you know when it's coming out, or you're not sure?
I think in the next, it should be around when the book's official pub date. It should be around the end of the month.
Amazing. Okay, I'll keep an eye out for that. Thank you so much. And yeah, thank you again for joining me.
Thanks for having
And
me on.
for our listeners, thank you so much for listening, and goodbye.